Welcome to the introductory lecture on Slaughterhouse 5 by Kurt Vonnegut. To begin our discussion, I would like to read a passage from a review of the book published in 1969, a review that came out shortly after the book itself. It is written by Michael Crichton and appears in the New Republic. Vonnegut writes about the most excruciatingly painful things. His novels have attacked our deepest fears of automation and the bomb, our deepest political guilt, our fiercest hatreds and loves. Nobody else writes books on these subjects. They are inaccessible to normal novelistic approaches. But Vonnegut, armed with his schizophrenia, takes an absurd, distorted, wildly funny framework, which is ultimately an aesthetic. And here in 1969, Michael Crichton correctly diagnoses one of the things that's going to qualitatively separate Slaughterhouse 5 from all the books that precede in the American canon before it. Even if you take a look at the most widely read books in the American canon, such as The Adventures of Huckleberry Finn, or The Great Gatsby, or Catcher in the Rye, there is something that is qualitatively different about Kurt Vonnegut's book, Slaughterhouse 5. This book doesn't work like the old books. This book is different in how it's assembled, different in how it works in terms of narration. It wants to invent new forms and new rules for the craft of fiction to hold Vonnegut's message. The first chapter spends a great deal of time discussing Vonnegut's frustration in being unable ultimately to write a book, a traditional book about his experience in Dresden during 1945. I'm on page 2. I would hate to tell you what this lousy little book cost me in money and anxiety and time. When I got home from the Second World War 23 years ago, I thought it would be easy for me to write about the destruction of Dresden, since all I would have to do would be report on what I had seen. And I thought, too, that it would be a masterpiece, or at least make me a lot of money, since the subject was so big. But not many words about Dresden came from my mind then, not enough for them to make a book anyway. And not many words come now either, when I have become an old fart with his memories and his Pall Malls, with his sons full grown. I think of how useless the Dresden part of my memory has been, and yet how tempting Dresden has been to write about. And so on. If you skip ahead just a few pages, he illustrates his desire to write a book when one afternoon he outlines the entire straightforward chronological narrative on a roll of wallpaper. I'm on page 5 now. I used my daughter's crayons, a different color for each main character. One end of the wallpaper was the beginning of the story, and the other end was the end. And then there was all that middle part, which was the middle. And the blue line met the red line, and then the yellow line. And then the yellow line stopped because the character represented by the yellow line was dead, and so on. The destruction of Dresden was represented by a vertical band of orange cross-hatching, and all the lines that were still alive passed through it came out at the other side. The end, where all the line stops, was a beat filled on the L. So Vonnegut tells us in very straightforward language that he has written previous novels. He's written a whole box of short stories by the time we get to the late 60s. And what he says is that he has trafficked in climaxes, and narration, and characterization, and drama. He knows how to write a straightforward chronological novel. He's read a great deal. He's published books. But for some reason, the tools that he has that have allowed him to produce these earlier books are inadequate for producing a narrative message about his experience in Dresden. And out of this very natural experience, out of 23 years of frustration, Vonnegut arrives at the point where he decides that he's going to have to invent a new novel form to hold this message. This is not experimentation by design, this is experimentation by desperation. And so this book, by taking 23 years to get to the page, does some very interesting things in terms of the formal properties of the novel. On the one hand, this book is a work of art. It's here to explore some very high-minded ideals about war, about human nature, about the aftermath of traumatic experience. But on the other hand, this book is also about the construction of art. It is the construction of art seen side by side with the finished product of art. This book is a work of fiction. Billy Pilgrim's made up. A number of the characters that accompany Billy Pilgrim to the prisoner of war camps are made up. But at the same time, this is also a work of metafiction. That is, this is a book that's very interested in the investigation of what makes fiction, or how fiction comes into being, or what fiction is ultimately intended to accomplish, both for the audience and for the author himself. This is a book that's interested in developing a protagonist, a main character, Billy Pilgrim. But this is also a book that's interested in charting the author's relationship to the character that he creates. And so we have a number of things moving in and out from each other. This is going to be a book that, in one hand, works like books we've previously seen, such as Catcher in the Rye or The Great Gatsby, or The Adventures of Huckleberry Finn, in that we do have a story about a specific period of American involvement. But on the other hand, this is going to be a book about the making of a book and what the making of the book does for its author. In addition to that, this book is going to dispense with a number of other common fiction tropes in favor of low art science fiction. I'm much later in the book. I'm up on page 87. Well, before I get to page 87, Vonnegut tells us right at the beginning what we're in for. I'm on the title page before we jump up to 87. Slaughterhouse 5, or The Children's Crusade, A Duty Dance with Death by Kurt Vonnegut. A fourth-generation German-American now living in easy circumstances on Cape Cod and smoking too much, who, as an American infantry scout, forced to combat, as a prisoner of war, witnessed the firebombing of Dresden, Germany, the Florence of the Elbe, a long time ago, and survived to tell the tale. This is a novel somewhat in the telegraphic, schizophrenic manner of Tales of the Planet Tralfamadore, where the flying saucers come from, peace. Now hold that in your mind for a second, that here on the title page, before we even get the first line of narration, Kurt Vonnegut is telling us that this book has been consciously assembled after the manner of those books that one would find on the planet Tralfamadore. And to explain that, Kurt Vonnegut has thoughtfully included a description of a book from Tralfamadore in his own book. Now I'm on page 87. Billy has just been picked up by the Tralfamadorians, and here we go. Billy asked for something to read on the trip to Tralfamadore. His captors had 5 million Earthling books on microfilm, but no way to project them in Billy's cabin. He had only one actual book in English, which would be placed in a Tralfamadorian museum. It was Valley of the Dolls by Jacqueline Suzanne. Well, let me just stop there for a second. This is a joke that back in 1969 would have been immediately apparent and funny to all of Vonnegut's original readers. Valley of the Dolls is a trashy soap opera. This would be like advanced aliens coming to Earth right now and deciding to take off with the first 5 seasons of Beverly Hills 90210 as a representative work of Earthling art and Earthling culture. Billy read it, thought it was pretty good in spots. The people in it certainly had their ups and downs, but Billy didn't want to read about the same ups and downs over and over again. He asked if there wasn't, please, some other reading matter around. Only Tralfamadorian novels, which I'm afraid you couldn't begin to understand, said the speaker on the wall. Let me look at one anyway. So they sent him in several. They were little things. A dozen of them might have had the bulk of the Valley of the Dolls, with all of its ups and downs, ups and downs. Billy couldn't read Tralfamadorian, of course, but he could at least see how the books were laid out. In brief clumps of symbols separated by stars, Billy commented that the clumps might be telegrams. Exactly, said the voice. They are telegrams? There are no telegrams on Tralfamadore, but you're right. Each clump of symbols is a brief, urgent message, describing a situation, a scene. We Tralfamadorians read them all at once, not one after the other. There isn't any particular relationship between the messages except that the author has chosen them carefully so that when seen all at once, they produce an image of life that is beautiful and surprising and deep. There is no beginning, no middle, no end, no suspense, no moral, no causes, no effects. What we love in our books are the depths of many marvelous moments seen all at one time. And so here Vonnegut tips his hat momentarily to tell us how we should view this book in terms of its formal structure. Well, this is a Tralfamadorian novel, or it's written in the style of the Tralfamadorian novels. And so this book is meant to be short. It's only a couple hundred pages. And if you look at individual pages, there's a lot of padding, and well, the space between the letters is called leading, and there's a lot of white space there. And so this is a very short book. It's maybe 200 pages in your printed bound book, but this would have been 130 or 140 manuscript pages when Vonnegut turned it in. Vonnegut's telling us that this is how we should approach this book. One of the things that has been dispensed with is chronology. Supposedly the events don't happen one after the other. And here he tells us, well, that's the point. What you're supposed to do is see all of these images next to each other, juxtaposed purposely, so that you can get a pleasing, deep, and complex image of Billy Pilgrim and the problems that he struggles with after he returns home from World War II. So this book not only wants to deliver some new ideas about the war, this book also wants to create a new form to hold those ideas. Having said that, it would probably also be useful to point out that this book has technically two parts to it. It has a very short first part, which is embodied mostly in the first chapter, and then a very long second part, which is chapters 2 through the end of the book. The first chapter, well, it is mostly an essay or a memoir of Vonnegut's experience attempting to write this book, Slaughterhouse 5, and chapters 2 through the end are, well, the novel with some commentary that Vonnegut actually produces. But by including that first chapter in there, Vonnegut, well, he places himself in the novel as though he is a character in his own work. And so I'd like to begin with a discussion of the author's life. In previous books we've looked at, we didn't look that closely at the author's life. And in part the reason for that is that the author did not include himself in his own work, or did not include herself in her own work. But here the book has taken into its materials that this is a book about Kurt Vonnegut trying to produce a book. This book, though it works with time travel and other science fiction elements, though it has space aliens that look like plungers with little eyes in the palm of their hands, though it has many fantastical elements in it, beneath that, this is a book about Kurt Vonnegut trying to expel the demons that he carried with him after World War II, and to place them in something tangible, into a book, as a means of him finally moving on beyond the horrors of what he saw in World War II. And since this is a first-person memoir / novel, since this book is clearly inviting us to make comparisons between Vonnegut's life and the work that he produces, I want to pull in some things about Vonnegut's life and talk about how they've influenced the development of this book. Kurt Vonnegut was born on November 11th, 1922, the youngest of 3 children. His father, Kurt Sr., is an architect, and his mother is from a socially prominent family in Indianapolis, where they had lived for 3 generations. Vonnegut would have grown up, well, for his early years, in a very expensive house in an upscale neighborhood. He went to private school for a while. He would have had a library stocked with classics. He would have had some servants at his house. But he also would have grown up in the moral religious center of the United States. And you can see that element in conflict in this book. This is very much a book written by a person who has grown up from a traditional belief system that after witnessing World War II, the mechanized warfare, the extermination of tens of thousands of people in an organized massacre, is asking himself, how can we as people do this? How can we as a group of people allow these types of wars to go on, to have one war after another? What is wrong with ourselves? That seems to be one of the underlying questions of this book. Who are we, and why do we let wars continue in the way that they have for the past hundreds of years? Growing up, Vonnegut would have had a religious understanding of mankind. He would have seen people as basically good. He would have seen the United States as a nation that protected weak people, that protected refugees, that protected non-combatants, non-military combatants. And so he is deeply troubled by what he's seen over in World War II. And you can see those two large philosophical viewpoints in conflict with each other. On the one hand, Vonnegut grew up believing in the essential goodness of individuals, in groups of people. And on the other hand, in World War II, he saw, well, what happens when groups of people get together? They try to exert their will on other people. They kill them, they hurt them, they damage them in the name of a good cause. He wants to know which one is the more authoritative view to have. Are we really basically good as our core nature, or do we really strive to exert our will over other groups of people? This is one of the questions that's beneath the book. And you can see this thread going way back into Vonnegut's childhood. The stock market crash of 1929 breaks Vonnegut's family. They lose their house, they have to move into a middle-class neighborhood. Though Vonnegut's older siblings all went to private schools, there isn't money for Kurt to continue at a private school, and so he has to go to a public school. This library that they had in their house, that's gone. And so, well, the high-minded, high-art young childhood that Vonnegut experienced goes away. In his early youth, Vonnegut would have gone to operas and plays. He would have been introduced to Dickens and Huck Finn and Edgar Allan Poe. He would have visited museums that were displaying works of high art. Well, then after a certain point in his boyhood, he goes off in these middle-class neighborhoods, and his friends would have taken him down to the movie theater where they'd watch serials such as Buck Rogers, or they would have seen cowboy western serials. They would have seen a number of popular entertainments there. He would have listened to radio detective dramas. And you see these two influences, these two very different influences in his early childhood. You see the high art of his young childhood, and then you see the low art, or the popular art of his later childhood. You see, well, high art would be interests such as, well, who are we as people? How should we act during war? And low art would be things such as space aliens from Buck Rogers. And in this book, he's conflating. He's taking high art and low art and trying to push them together to create one continuous narrative. In this book, the author is interested in trying to come to an understanding of what was Americans' moral responsibility for their actions in Dresden. In this book, Vonnegut wants to take a look at how people deal with trauma. How do they get over trauma? What happens when you've been through a war and survived it? That's one of the things this novel wants to take a look at. But then on the other hand, this novel wants to have fart jokes. This novel has slapstick humor. This novel has space aliens. This novel has time travel. It's taken all of those things, high art and low art, and pushed them together to create a very unique book. While at home, we've done that one. In college, he goes to Cornell University. He studies biology and chemistry. He wants to be a chemical engineer originally. He had wanted to study arts, the English and writing in particular, but his father told him that he should study something, quote, more practical. And so in his own time, he continues to write in college. He also edits the school newspaper. After college, he studies mechanical engineering as part of his training for the military, and then prepares to ship out to England after the war is already going. Shortly before he leaves, he returns home to Indianapolis, where in May of 1944, his mother commits suicide by overdosing on sleeping pills. And you can see this too. Vonnegut has this impersonal experience with death. He's witnessed the aftermath of the Dresden fire bombings, where tens of thousands of people lost their lives, people that Vonnegut, for the most part, did not know. But also at the same time in his life, there's the death of his mother by her own hands, suicide. And so there is this question, how do we deal with death? What does death mean? How do we account for it? How do we absorb it? If we as people are designed, or if we're made to believe in the value of life, if we think that life is good and should continue, what do we do about death? And there's this double lens apparatus that this book looks at. Vonnegut has this personal experience, the death of his mother, and he also has this wartime experience, the impersonal death of tens of thousands of people, and this is also animating some of the material in this book. How do we deal with death? Is Billy Pilgrim's assertion that, well, so it goes, that people are just alive in different points of temporal history, is that good enough for us to account for death? In England, Vonnegut receives further training as an infantryman, then joins the 106th Infantryman Division. Within months of active duty, while participating at the Battle of the Bulge, Vonnegut is captured, just like Billy Pilgrim, on December 19th, 1944, and, just like Billy Pilgrim, becomes a prisoner of war in Germany. He is sent by rail to Dresden, which was considered an open city, a city that, because of its architectural beauty, cultural treasures, and lack of military targets, was considered off limits for airstrikes, just like Billy Pilgrim. By the time we get to early 1945, Vonnegut feels that he's safe. He's in Dresden. This is a city that has a number of architectural treasures, very old buildings, has a number of works of art housed there. Vonnegut is under the impression that there's no military training areas in Dresden, that there's no manufacturing companies that are contributing significantly to the German war effort, and therefore, well, there's no reason for the Allied forces to bomb it. Vonnegut also has a job making this vitamin-enriched malt syrup, which is the exact same job that Billy Pilgrim has in the book. And so he's able to sneak spoonfuls of this rich, syrupy, sugary vitamin substance, so he has a pretty good source of food. He's heard from other people that the Germans are running out of material, that they're in trouble. And so he knows, or he believes, that if he can just hang on for another 6 months, or maybe a year and a half at most, he's going to be just fine. The war will be over, and he will be repatriated back to American forces. If he can just hold on, he should be good. He's got food, he's got shelter. He's in a city that doesn't have a great deal of military involvement, and so he's in a pretty good spot for being a prisoner of war. But then, on the evening of February 13th and 14th, Dresden is destroyed in a controversial firestorm raid by bombers of the Royal Air Force and the U.S. Army Air Force in an attempt to speedily end the war by a show of overwhelming force. At this point in Dresden's history, it is swelling with refugees. The population of Germany is in flux. People are leaving towns that have been attacked. People are leaving homes because they are close to where the fighting is going on, and refugees are moving from town to town, which is why we will never know how many people die in the Dresden firestorms. The mayor's count officially is 135,000. But there are other estimates that place the number closer to 250,000. And that's a pretty big gap. That's a gap of 115,000 people that may have lost their lives there, in addition to the base amount. We're never going to know. But even if we take the lower number, 135,000, well, Vonnegut believes that this is the largest organized massacre in the history of mankind. Never before has one group incinerated, wiped out 135,000 people in a planned massacre, ever. This number is larger than the deaths that come from Hiroshima, from the dropping of the atomic bomb in Japan. Vonnegut feels that he's witnessed the largest massacre, and therefore he feels a responsibility to write about it, only he's unable to do so. Vonnegut and his platoon of workers survive because they are quartered in a meat locker far enough underground to escape asphyxiation and incineration. Pressed into service as a corpse miner, Vonnegut participates in the cleanup of the city. And the city after the bombings would have been horrific. Skeletal buildings, piles of corpses. There would have been the smell of decaying flesh. There would have been this bubble of burnt residue covering everything. By late April, the advancing Russian army scares away Vonnegut's guards, and on May 22nd, Vonnegut is returned to American forces. Following his return home, he marries his childhood sweetheart, Jane Marie Cox, and on September 1st of that year, he begins graduate work in anthropology at the University of Chicago, paid for by the GI Bill. It is his training as an anthropologist that gives rise to a number of characters in this book. The Tralfamadorians are probably the most obvious example of the anthropologists in this book. And there are joke anthropologists. They say funny, ironic, sardonic things. Anthropology has as its aim to chart the movements of civilization from a great distance. And this is what the Tralfamadorians do. For example, they understand wars in this way. Wars are when one group of people heat up or change the environment to make it uninhabitable for another group of people. Well, this is true. Bombs do create a great deal of heat and fire and make the area uninhabitable. But this understanding of a firestorm, of bombings, really misses any human impact that it might have. And so these are one joke anthropologist that's in the book. The other one is Howard W. Campbell. Howard W. Campbell is the American who's defected to become a Nazi. And he's written a monograph to explain to the Nazis how Americans are, why they think the way they do. And I'll just read you a short passage from that monograph. And it, too, is an example of this kind of joke anthropology that's peppered throughout the book. This is from Campbell's writing. America is the wealthiest nation on earth, but its people are mainly poor, and poor Americans are urged to hate themselves. To quote the American humorist Ken Hubbard, "It ain't no disgrace to be poor, but it might as well be. It is in fact a crime for an American to be poor, even though America is a nation of poor. Every other nation has folk traditions of men who were poor but extremely wise and virtuous and therefore more estimable than anyone with power and gold. No such tales are told by American poor. They mock themselves and glorify their betters. The meanest eating or drinking establishment owned by a man who is himself poor is very likely to have a sign on its wall asking this cruel question: if you're so smart, why ain't you rich? There will also be an American flag no larger than a child's hand glued to a lollipop stick and flying from the cash register." Okay, so Vonnegut throws these anthropologists into his book, and this is something that Vonnegut has studied, and I believe the larger point that Vonnegut's trying to make is this. This type of study is not useful in understanding what wars really do. You can't look at things from this distance and come to reasonable conclusions, nor can you guide anyone through the experience of coming out of a war if all you do is look at people in groups from such distance. And so he throws some of his academic training into the book, as though to say, hey, all your book learning ain't gonna get you that far in life. While at college, while in graduate school, Vonnegut finds that very few people are willing to critically examine the bombing of Dresden. It's overshadowed by the atrocities committed by the Germans, the killing of 6 million Jews, but Vonnegut is neither able to explain nor justify America and Britain's involvement in the fiery extermination of tens of thousands of German citizens, most without any military connection. Through official channels, he learns that the Dresden firebombing has been classified as top secret, and Vonnegut believes it has been classified so that its memory will die from history. Additionally, he finds his professors unwilling to examine American motives or strategies inside the war. And we have an example of that in the book itself. I'm on page 10. I happened to tell a University of Chicago professor at a cocktail party about the raid as I had seen it. About the book I would write, he was a member of a thing called the Committee on Social Thought. And he told me about the concentration camps and about how Germans had made soap and candles out of the fat of dead Jews and so on. All I could say was, I know. And so when Vonnegut returns from the war, he's seen something that He feels the American government doesn't want it spread around. He's survived Dresden. He knows what Americans and the British did there. And he tries to tell other people about it, and he finds that they're uninterested. He also finds that the American government is unwilling to let him have any documents about the firebombing of Dresden to satisfy his interest in knowing more about why this happened, who called for it, what was our underlying national motivation to call for the death of tens of thousands of civilians. Vonnegut drops out of graduate school. He completes all of his coursework, but he doesn't complete his master's thesis. This would be somewhat like finishing college, but not completing your senior project. And instead he moves to Schenectady, New York, and takes a job as a publicist for GE. It is during this period that he begins writing short stories. They started to appear in magazines in the early 50s, and in 1952 his first novel, Player of Piano, was published by Scribner's. Throughout the 1950s, he publishes short stories and novels, works odd jobs, he sells cars, he teaches the emotionally disturbed. He works in public relations, though slowly his reputation as a fiction writer grows, particularly with a younger audience. In 1965, the University of Iowa invites him to come to Iowa City to teach for 2 years in the nation's best-known creative writing program. It's the University of Iowa's Writers' Workshop. And while there, from 1965 to 1967, Vonnegut again returns to his Dresden novel. Well, over 20 years have passed from the time that Vonnegut was in Dresden to the time that he writes the first successful draft of his Dresden novel. Well, during this time, the ideas have moved around in his head. He's been able to pull them apart and put them back together. He's also reached the point where he understands that a traditional, straightforward narrative is not going to be an effective novel to hold the type of philosophical ideas that he would like to put into this novel. He wants to talk about why we are the way we are. When we're in groups, when we are in nation states, why are we always so protective? Why are we warlike? Why do we want to exert our will over the will of other groups? He sees this as a fundamental problem of human nature. He also wants to write about the meaning of death. He also wants to write about how we overcome trauma, and he says that he's unable to do that in a straightforward novel like The Great Gatsby or Catcher in the Rye. These types of straightforward, chronological, narrative books can't hold the ideas that he wants to put into fiction. And by now, after struggling with this, after being frustrated with this writing project for 20 years, he's able to put together this experimental novel, this Tralfamadorian novel, that holds some of these ideas. The year after he finishes his stint at the University of Iowa's Writers' Workshop, he goes back to Dresden in 1968, where he has a Guggenheim Fellowship to observe the progress of Dresden. I'm on page 1. This is the part that's referred to right as we open the novel. I really did go back to Dresden with the Guggenheim money, God love it, in 1967. It looked a lot like Dayton, Ohio, more open spaces than Dayton has. There must have been tons of human bone meal on the ground. I went back there with an old war buddy, Bernard B. O'Hare, and we made friends with a cab driver who took us to the slaughterhouse where we had been locked up at night as prisoners of war. His name was Gerhard Mueller. He told us that he was a prisoner of the Americans for a while. We asked him how it was to live under communism, and he said that it was terrible at first because everybody had to work so hard and because there wasn't much shelter or food or clothing. But things were much better now. He had a pleasant little apartment, and his daughter was getting an excellent education. His mother was incinerated in the Dresden firestorm. So it goes. He sent O'Hare a postcard at Christmas time, and here's what it said. I wish you and your family, also as to your friend, Merry Christmas and a Happy New Year, and I hope that we'll meet again in a world of peace and freedom, in the taxi cab if the accident will. I like that very much, if the accident will. In one interview, Vonnegut told the reporter, quote, it seemed a categorical imperative that I write about Dresden, the firebombing of Dresden, since it was the largest massacre in the history of Europe, And I'm a person of European extraction, and I, a writer, had been present. I had to say something about it. But as he remarks in the novel, his fear is, quote, there is nothing intelligent to say about a massacre. In another interview, Vonnegut says, quote, when we went to war, we felt our government was a respecter of life, careful about not injuring civilians and that sort of thing. Well, Dresden had no tactical value. It was a city of civilians. Yet the Allies bombed it until it burned and melted, and then they lied about it. And that was startling to us. In 1969, Vonnegut publishes Slaughterhouse 5 with the Delacour Press, which becomes an immediate bestseller and establishes Vonnegut as an anti-war spokesman for the Vietnam generation, as well as one of the early spokesmen for a new breed of experimental novels. And here's his new book, recently published, and as we launch into it, what we see in that first chapter is Vonnegut not only talking about how he's created this work, not only talking about his personal process in transforming memoir into fiction. In that first chapter, Vonnegut goes around and asks a lot of people in different ways, how did you get over World War II? He asked Gerhard Mueller that in the cab. How did you get over World War II? Well, Mueller says, though not quite in these words, that he's trying to move on. His daughter's getting a good education. He wants to live in a world where there's peace and freedom. He's asking the professor at the University of Chicago, how did you move on? And the professor's telling him, well, I moved on by thinking about what the Germans did to the Jews. I ignore or I diminish the consequences of the American war atrocities by focusing on the German war atrocities. In other words, America's not as bad as the Germans in World War II. Well, he's asking his friend Bernard O'Hare, how did you get on after World War II? Well, Bernard O'Hare, he can't remember anything. He's either choosing not to remember it because it is too painful, or he's unable to access those memories. These things are beyond him. He's getting beyond it by putting it out of his mind, either through will or through some other stronger force. The nicest veterans, those that saw frontline duty, they're getting beyond it by seeking true, deep, caring relationships with other people. Mary O'Hare, well, she's getting beyond the war by asking Vonnegut not to write about it. To write about the war is only going to perpetuate the cycle of war. If you make your book look like a fantastic movie that would star John Wayne, she tells Vonnegut, that's only going to create more wars. That's going to send more babies off to war. And well, Vonnegut himself is wondering how or if he's going to be able to get beyond World War II. He has this disease where late at night, after drinking a little bit and starting to smoke, he starts to call his friends, his old war buddies, because though 23 years have passed since he's been in the war, he still thinks about it all the time. Give him a little drink and he's back there. He wants to find people who can talk about it with him, as though, well, the art of talk might somehow take him beyond the experience of what it is that he's seen. He's aware that America is not really able to get beyond World War II. In the logic of this book tells us that World War II is undigested experience. America as a nation has blocked it. It doesn't want to look at what it did in Germany, in Dresden in particular. And because it's undigested experience, well, America's going to have a propensity to get in more wars. And Vonnegut is saying here in the late 60s that because America hasn't looked at how it truly acted in World War II, that it is now involved in another war that has some unjust elements in it, such as Vietnam. And he says as long as America doesn't look at its underlying motivation, it is likely that the cycle of warfare is going to continue. And so as Vonnegut launches into his book proper with Chapter 2, in Chapter 2 we first meet Billy Pilgrim. Listen, Billy Pilgrim has come unstuck in time. But before we even get to that sentence, Vonnegut has already brought forward a really rich table of intellectual materials, lenses through which we're going to see this book. Vonnegut is telling us that this book is not just a story about Billy Pilgrim, it's also a story about himself. This is how I, Vonnegut, am trying to get the experience of war out of my system. I'm writing a book about it. That's part of what this book's about. It's about the novel, the Billy Pilgrim story, but it's also about how Vonnegut produces it and the struggle he goes with to produce it, and what the production of this book might ultimately mean for Vonnegut himself. It's also, well, about Billy Pilgrim. Billy Pilgrim is a character that's suffering traumatic effects from the war. He has come unstuck in time. He's returning to that war over and over in this book. He can't seem to get away from it. And this book wants to talk about how, well, how soldiers, how civilians, how nations are supposed to move beyond graphic, violent warfare. It's interested in that. This book is interested in why we as people get in wars over and over again. What is it about our nature that is pugnacious, that draws us to wars, and what can we do about this? This book wants to examine how is it that we as individuals, as lovers of life, people who value being alive, how is it that we're supposed to accommodate death? What is the philosophical means by which we're supposed to approach that experience? By the time we get to chapter 2, this book has brought in a lot of strong themes and asks us to consider them as we work our way through the Billy Pilgrim story. The Billy Pilgrim story, I'll say this before I let you go, the Billy Pilgrim story is meant to be seen as a book that has no chronology. Vonnegut tells us this in a number of places. Billy Pilgrims come unstuck in time. Well, this novel's come unstuck in time as well. We have no true chronology. But I will tell you this, it's only an illusion that the novel's unstuck in time. The novel does have a chronology in it. And so as you work your way through this book, if you're finding that it's a little bit difficult to keep track of where you are, the main story is told in a straightforward chronological way. That is, Billy Pilgrim goes to Germany. Billy Pilgrim is captured. Billy Pilgrim gets on the train in Germany to take him to the prisoner of war camps. Billy Pilgrim arrives in the prisoner of war camps. Billy Pilgrim goes to Dresden. Most all of those long scenes are told in a straightforward chronological fashion, and it is only the peripheral scenes, the scenes with his daughter, the scenes of his wedding anniversary, and so on, that are told outside of that chronology. So there truly is a backbone in this book that does have a chronological formation, if that helps you proceed with a little more ease through the rest of the book. Hope you found this helpful. See you soon.